Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. This is part 2 of the lecture on the French Third Republic from 1870 to 1914. We discussed French politics, political parties, society, and in the first video we discussed the foundations of the political order in France and then the Boulanger phenomenon, the rise of activism, right-wing nationalistic activism in the case of Boulanger. So, as I said before, in 1887, there's a danger of overthrow of the Republic and a coup d'etat, and then it fizzled out and the guy killed himself. So the next important incident would be the so-called Panama Canal scandal. That is also in the row of events that are connected with anti-Semitism. So this would be number 2 event out of 3 that are connected with the rise of right-wing populism and anti-Semitism. So the Panama Canal basically was the story of a company building the Panama Canal going bankrupt. Pretty much as they did when they did the Suez Canal and the British took it over. Now this time they go bankrupt and the Americans take it over. So the French have a bad habit of building canals, then somebody else, they do all the hard work, then they go bankrupt and then somebody else takes over. So that's the case with the Panama Canal as well. But the problem was that there was a political scandal and there was corruption and there were money stolen. The right-wing press turned it in a way that it's not just bad people who stole money, but the bad people who stole money are the Jewish financiers, and therefore they made it look like it is a Jewish theft by the Jews, and created the connection between the scandal of corruption and turned it into an anti-Semitic campaign. One of the newspapers was called Parole Libre, and that was the sort of right-wing newspaper that mobilized anti-Semitic feeling in France. In 1892, this is when the Panama Canal scandal broke out. They formed a new organization which is called League of Patriots, which was an anti-Semitic, right-wing, nationalistic, anti-German organization. That wrote in its pages of Free Press France, Jews conspired to dominate France. The Panama Canal scandal is linked to Jewish financiers. So this is event number 2 that is kind of rocking French public opinion and mobilizes the right-wing public opinion in defense of Catholic Church, against the Jews and against the Germans. Now, interesting part is, of course, against the Germans, because in France, there's this lingering feeling of national injury, that really, speaking about the Third Republic, you cannot ignore that. The defeat of 1870 is a very, very heavy blow to French confidence, to French self-identity, and to French feeling of superiority that lasted for 200 years. I mean, throughout the 18th century, the French were convinced that they were the best and the most important ones, and they were culturally. And then Napoleon, of course, thought that Prussia, he spoke with a kind of a disdain, would never be able to do anything. And then all of a sudden, that Prussia, 50 years later, after Napoleon defeats France on the battlefield, which is extremely hard to stomach. Not only do they defeat them, but they lose Alsace-Lorraine, which is a big, big wound. There are all kinds of pictures showing that the Germans cut off a piece of a beautiful female body, which is France, and then they just torture France and cut off her feet or her legs or whatever. I mean, it's like very, very hard for the French society to come to terms that they lost Alsace-Lorraine. Also because Alsace is German. People there speak German, and they are kind of afraid that they lost it forever. Now, in Lorraine, it's the majority of people, one could say, are French-speaking, maybe 50-50, but in Alsace, definitely, the strip of land along the Rhine is a German-speaking province, which of course, they missed terribly, and that is why there is tremendous anti-German feeling in the so-called patriotic nationalist circles of France. So event number 3 that galvanized France and shook it to the very core, almost to a civil conflict, was the Dreyfus Affair. And we have spoken already about Dreyfus Affair in the context of anti-Semitism and Jews, but basically in a nutshell for this lecture, Dreyfus was a captain in the French army. He was accused of delivering documents to the German embassy. He was tried. He was found guilty. He was dishonored. They broke his sword. They deprived him of his military rank, and they exiled him to some faraway island. But that was not the end of the story. There were a lot of people who felt there was something wrong, that the evidence was not complete, and then they started digging, and the whole society divided up into Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. And those who defend Dreyfus, but defending Dreyfus was not only to defend this particular individual and find if he's guilty or not. Defending Dreyfus meant that you are for tolerance, that you do support that the Jews are loyal, that they could be and should be in the army and everywhere else, that you're not driven by hatred of somebody just because of his religion or nationality. So you basically have the Catholic Church and the army and the elites are basically the haute bourgeoisie. They are, of course, against Dreyfus. And you have the socialists and you have the radicals, which is the liberals, who are for Dreyfus. And it is then that the Émile Zola, a famous French writer, writes a very, very famous pamphlet, J'accuse, where he lists accusations against the ruling elite. I accuse you of this, and I accuse you of that, about the procedure, about prejudice, about injustice, about all kinds of things. It was a very powerful document that shook up, and that is when people begin to take sides, Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. Well, in any case, the story ended with acquittal. A second trial was held, and then there was discovered that the documents were fabricated accusing Dreyfus, and the real spy was Esterházy, who was a Hungarian diplomat who lived in France. He was completely cleared and restored to his rank in the French army in 1906, but the guy was so traumatized and so shaken up that it really didn't help much, except to restore his name. J'accuse was published in 1898, so the affair lasts from 1898 to 1906, the time when Dreyfus was finally returned his honor. Okay. 1906 is a very important moment where you have a new regime coming to power, and that is the Radical Party together with the Socialists. So it's a kind of a center-left coalition that comes to power. What you have to understand, we already know what the agenda of the Socialists is. It is the working classes. The agenda of the Radicals and their bourgeois centrist party, the Liberal Party, is in the context of France, anti-Catholic and what they call anti-clerical. So specifically what they are doing is several reforms. For example, they confiscate ecclesiastical estates. They revise the payment of salaries to the priests. They they exile from France all the religious orders, and they completely secularize education in France, which is up to the present time. Religion has no place in the curriculum of the schools. The schools are free, obligatory, for all boys and girls, and they are secular, nothing to do with the church. So this would be this, and of course this finds vicious protest of the clericals, of the Pope, and he doesn't like it, and there's a protest, and so there's a kind of a anti-clerical agenda is the secularist agenda of the radicals, and the socialist agenda is the one of the Socialist Party. In that government, 1899, for the first time ever in Europe, in any country of Europe, a socialist, a member of the Socialist Party, joins the government. His name is Mitterrand, as a minister. And this is the beginning of a long, long story where socialists are going to come to power in many, many more countries, including Labour Party in Britain. This is the beginning of a new century and the beginning of the coming triumph of the Marxist and neo-Marxist parties of socialists and the Social Democrats. So 1902, exile of religious orders, took possession of all church property, condemnation by the Pope, and that is the agenda of this government. Now, the upper hand in this government are the so-called radical, which is not really radical, but it is the party of, as I said, liberal centrists in France. And one of their major leaders is Clemenceau. And he would be a very famous person during World War I, and he would lead France during World War I, and then in peace negotiations in 1918. So Clemenceau starts his career. Now, a couple of words about Clemenceau. He is a radical, and that means anti-clerical, but at the same time, he is a very dictatorial and nationalistic leader. In fact, he doesn't like the socialists. He actually doesn't like them at all. And he's also very much against socialist unions, Confédération de Travail, but at the same time, he's against the church and against the Germans. So he kind of combines all of those things together, being against the church and against the socialist unions, trade unions, and against the Germans as well. For example, in 1907, Clemenceau sent troops to suppress the strike in the south of France, which is unheard of. I mean, it's only Americans who sent troops to suppress strikes, as they were known by that time in Chicago strike and other things that generated the 1st of May, the Day of Solidarity of working people. So it was not typical for France, and Clemenceau distinguished himself by sending the troops. So to sum up the domestic affairs, France is in turbulent times. It is a rule of the haute bourgeoisie, to put it in class terms. It is a period of instability. It is a period of the rise of two major forces that will play out a battle in the 20th century. Right-wing nationalists and the socialists. And you know what? The first half of 19th century is going to be a fight between those. In Spain, it would be nationalists and socialists. In Italy, it would be nationalists and socialists. In Russia, it would be nationalists and socialists. And of course, in Germany, it would be nationalist socialists, and they would call different names and call themselves different, but it's the ones that are against the Jews, for your own country, against the international conspiracy of socialists and communists and Marxists, and those that are for socialists and Marxists and workers that would be called socialists, and then the outgrowth of that would be communists. So in a sense, you could see in France the beginnings of political movements that are going to shake up Europe in the decades to come. But before I finish, I must say a few words about foreign affairs in that period, the foreign affairs of France in its relationship to its neighbors. Now, the most important relationship would be defined as France versus Germany, France versus England, and France versus Russia. So these are the three most important relationships. Now, France with Germany, I have already discussed it, and it's best described by a German term, which is called Primat der Innenpolitik, which means primacy of domestic politics. Now, what I mean by that is that the hatred of Germany is deliberately set up and supported and inflamed by the primacy of domestic politics. Domestic politics is that certain people deliberately, like Boulanger, promote it because that's how they want to gain public support. That's how they want to get elected. So in a sense, it is not really, recent research showed that France had reconciled itself by 1914 with the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. And yet, it was a kind of a taboo. You couldn't say publicly, oh, well, we lost it. It's okay. We can live without it. No, it becomes a kind of mantra that you have to repeat: the Germans must be punished and we should get back Alsace-Lorraine. It's a kind of a public stance that had to be supported if you are patriotic French. It's a kind of a deliberate hostility against the Germans. Now that also defines a relationship with Russia. It's because, as Bismarck put it, look at the map. On one side is France, on the other side is Russia, and they tend to gravitate to each other, especially after Bismarck failed to support the Russians as they expected in the Russian-Turkish War, which is 1878, and that leads to a realignment. Russia and Germany are drifting apart despite Bismarck's efforts, and there's a rapprochement that would lead to a military alliance between France and Russia. And all of that is connected with the visit to France by the Tsar Alexander III. And if you come to Paris and if you go to the most beautiful bridge in Paris, right off the Place de la Concorde, that bridge is called Pont de Alexandre de Troyes. Who is Alexander de Troyes? It's a Russian Tsar who came to Paris and concluded a military alliance. That was a real alliance, and what I mean real is that the two sides had to come to each other's defense if one of them is attacked. Now that is not the kind of alliance which is entente cordiale between Britain and France, which is, they don't have to. They may if they want to. So the British never committed themselves to defending France, and Russia did commit itself to defend France. So this alliance is one of the most important happenings in the decades leading to World War I, because it created a paranoia in the minds of the Germans that they're surrounded, and that would lead to the creation of the Schlieffen Plan to strike France first before Russia can get its act together. All of that is connected with this feeling that France needs an ally to defend itself from the rising Germany, which leads France and Russia to conclude this alliance. And finally, the third and most important relationship, other than alliance with France and Britain, is British colonial empire. We talked about it in the lecture of imperialism, but here just to say that that is the time, from 1880 to 1914, that the French Empire is born. And by that I mean half of Africa is taken over by the French. And they're marching steadily from Algiers to Morocco. They're going to take it over in 1906 and 1912 with the Protectorate. So they'll control all of North Africa, most of Africa, and then the Cambodia and Vietnam in Asia. So all of that is happening is this time with a kind of empire building, jingoist, nationalist, anti-German, anti-Semitic government that at the same time maintains social reforms and a certain degree of civil liberties. That is what France is in the decades leading to World War I. And on that note, my dear boys and girls, don't forget to tell all your friends to increase the subscription. We need to increase the subscription, guys. Bring it to 1,000, and then we're going to start making money. Thank you very much.